I said, we don't have any available tables. Her voice, usually polished and soaked in artificial politeness, now carried an edge of irritation. I'm just asking for a seat. Don't you think you're overreacting? The man's voice was calm, his presence unassuming in a simple, slightly wrinkled shirt, an almost comical contrast to the tension vibrating in the air. A few heads turned. Some whispered, others hid amused smirks behind their crystal glasses. Victoria stepped forward, her lips curling into a condescending smirk. Maybe you should try somewhere a little less refined. People don't usually walk in here dressed like they just fixed a car. She expected frustration, maybe even a stammered excuse. Instead, the man simply tilted his head slightly, his eyes sweeping over the lavish decor. The chandelier's glow cast golden ripples across the marble floors, illuminating the pristine elegance of La Vienne, one of the most exclusive restaurants in New York. The kind of place where a glance at the menu could make a banker sweat, and where reservation lists were guarded like national secrets. The doors swung open, and he walked in. Not in a tailored suit, not in designer shoes, but in a simple, slightly wrinkled gray jacket and scuffed boots that had seen too many roads. Jackie Chan was a man used to moving through the world unnoticed when he chose to, until someone chose to notice him. Behind the reception desk, Victoria Hale barely concealed her disdain. Her uniform, crisp and perfectly tailored, mirrored the rigid control she demanded of her environment. La Vienne was her kingdom, and its patrons were the chosen few, the ones who belonged, the ones who deserved to be here. And then there was him. She didn't need to ask his name. She knew it wasn't on the list. Men like him never were. Still, she played the game, tilting her head with calculated politeness. May I help you? The words dripped with an artificial sweetness, the kind used when someone already knew the answer but wanted to hear the embarrassment spill from the other person's lips. Jackie met her gaze unreadable, polite, calm, unmoved. I'd like a table, please. A flicker of something crossed Victoria's face. Surprise? Amusement? Whatever it was, it vanished just as quickly. She folded her arms, an eyebrow arching. Sir, this is a very exclusive establishment. Are you sure you're in the right place? Now would you like to see a menu? Now do you have a reservation? No, are you sure? As if he had stumbled into a world he didn't belong in. A murmur stirred the bar. Whispers exchanged between couples dressed in cashmere and silk. Eyes flickered toward the entrance, scanning Jackie's attire, measuring him. Jackie remained unshaken. His gaze didn't waver, his expression didn't shift. He simply nodded. Yes, this is the place. Victoria exhaled sharply through her nose, as if debating whether to push further. She turned to her computer, fingers dancing over the keys with exaggerated flair, a performance meant to make a point. Finally, she turned back with a triumphant smirk. I'm sorry, sir, but I don't see your name in the reservations. The pause was deliberate. She waited for him to admit defeat, to shuffle backward toward the exit like so many before him who had dared to step into a world that wasn't theirs. Instead, Jackie smiled. A small, quiet smile. The kind that suggested he had seen this all before. That's all right, he said, his voice steady. I'll wait. Another murmur rippled through the room. Wait? Wait for what? People like him didn't wait. They left. They understood the unspoken rules, that even in a place where money was king, some doors remained locked. Victoria's fingers tightened around the mouse. She wasn't used to resistance. Not like this. We have a policy, she said, her smile turning thin. We prioritize our VIP guests. The wait could be very long. Still, Jackie stood there. Still, unshaken. I understand. Something flickered in Victoria's gaze, irritation. She didn't like this. Didn't like that he wasn't playing by the script. A moment of hesitation. Then, with an exaggerated sigh, she grabbed a menu and turned sharply. Right this way. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she led him through the dining hall, not to the plush booths overlooking the city's skyline, not to the velvet-lined seats reserved for the elite. She took him to the back, to a dimly lit corner near the kitchen doors, where the hum of dishwashers and the clatter of plates drowned out the piano's melody, where the smell of seared steak was tainted by a faint hint of bleach from freshly cleaned floors. She placed the menu down with a thud. Here, this should be comfortable for you. Her voice was syrupy sweet, but the insult was clear. Jackie didn't react. Not a single muscle in his face moved. He pulled out the chair, sat down, and glanced at the menu as if he had just been given the finest seat in the house. Thank you. Victoria's smirk faltered, just for a second. She turned on her heel, whispering under her breath, "He won't last 5 minutes." From across the room, someone was watching. An older man, neatly dressed in a navy blue suit, swirled the wine in his glass, his sharp gaze flickering between Jackie and Victoria. A quiet smile curled at the corner of his lips, because he knew something Victoria didn't. Something that would change everything. The hum of conversation in La Vienne carried a rhythmic elegance, punctuated by the soft chime of crystal glasses and the muffled laughter of the elite. Victoria Hale, ever the queen of this domain, glided between tables, ensuring every patron received the warmth of her curated hospitality. Everyone except one. From her vantage point, she could see him, the man who didn't belong. Seated at the most isolated table in the restaurant, Jackie Chan appeared completely at ease, flipping through the menu with quiet patience. He wasn't looking around anxiously, wasn't shifting in his seat like a man who had just realized he had walked into a place far beyond his means. No, he was waiting. And Victoria hated that. There was something in his presence, something deliberate. He wasn't like the few lost souls who had wandered in before, the ones who had taken one look at the menu and made a hasty, embarrassed retreat. He was waiting for something, and she couldn't tell what. That made her uneasy. Across the room, the navy-suited gentleman who had been watching from a distance swirled the deep red liquid in his glass, his gaze never quite leaving Jackie. There was something knowing in his expression. Victoria exhaled sharply, straightened her uniform, and strode back toward the secluded table. The menu was in Jackie's hands, but she had no doubt he was merely pretending to read it. "Have you decided?" she asked, her voice a silk-threaded blade. Jackie looked up, his expression unreadable. "Yes." His fingers trailed down the page before stopping on one of the most expensive entrees, a dry-aged Wagyu filet, paired with black truffle risotto and a limited reserve wine selection. For the first time that evening, Victoria hesitated. This was the moment when the mask usually slipped, the moment when the illusion of wealth shattered. A flicker of hesitation, a second glance at the price, a feigned excuse. That's how these interactions always played out. But Jackie's face remained impassive. "Excellent choice," she said, composing herself. "Just to confirm, the filet is $350, and the wine pairing is an additional $200. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to an almost conspiratorial whisper. "I assume you're aware." He met her eyes with the same unshakable calm. "That sounds wonderful." For the first time that evening, something flickered in Victoria's chest, an unfamiliar, uncomfortable emotion. She had played this game before, but something about the way Jackie responded felt different. He wasn't protesting, nor was he playing into the insult. He was merely accepting the situation for what it was, and that was unsettling. The table next to them had begun to take notice. A young couple, dressed in evening wear, exchanged glances. The woman whispered something to her partner, whose brows furrowed in amusement. Victoria straightened, returning to her usual, calculated self. He was pretending. That had to be it. "Very well," she said, scribbling down the order with a flourish. "I'll place your order right away. But I should warn you, the chef prefers his creations to be enjoyed by those who truly appreciate fine dining." Jackie merely nodded, folding the menu and placing it back onto the table. "I'm sure it will be excellent." Victoria turned sharply, heading toward the kitchen, her heels clicking against the marble. Behind the bar, Liam, a junior waiter, watched her approach with an unreadable expression. He had witnessed the entire exchange, and while Victoria's performance of superiority had worked on countless others, something about tonight felt different. "He actually ordered?" Liam asked, raising an eyebrow. Victoria huffed, flipping open her notepad. "It won't last," she muttered. "He'll see the bill and disappear before the entree even arrives." But as she turned to hand off the order, a voice behind her made her pause. "I wouldn't be so sure of that." She spun around to see the navy-suited gentleman watching her from the bar, his wine glass raised ever so slightly. His expression was mild, yet there was something almost amused in his gaze. Victoria pursed her lips but said nothing, turning sharply toward the kitchen. Minutes passed, and Jackie remained at his table, his posture relaxed, as if he had been dining here for years. When the appetizer arrived, a delicately plated scallop dish with saffron-infused foam, The waiter placed it in front of him with a touch too much force, causing the plate to shift slightly. "Your first course," the server said, his tone filled with mock politeness. Jackie examined the dish before nodding. "Thank you." The server lingered for a second longer than necessary, waiting for something. A hesitation. A crack in composure. But Jackie simply picked up his fork and took a slow, deliberate bite. From across the restaurant, Victoria watched, her arms crossed. He was still here. And worse, he was enjoying himself. The murmurs from nearby tables continued, subtle but persistent. Who was this man? Why was he here? And why wasn't he reacting the way he was supposed to? Victoria could feel the balance of control slipping, and she didn't like it. Not one bit. "He won't make it to the main course," she muttered under her breath. "Just watch." But as she turned away, a quiet laugh reached her ears. The navy-suited gentleman had taken another sip of wine, his gaze never quite leaving Jackie's table. And in that moment, Victoria knew something was wrong. Something was about to happen, something she hadn't planned for. The murmur of conversation in La Vienne continued, but now it carried an undercurrent of curiosity. Something about the man seated in the far corner, the one who should have left by now, was beginning to unsettle the natural order of the restaurant. Jackie Chan, unfazed, continued his meal with quiet precision. Each bite was deliberate, his posture relaxed. He wasn't eating quickly, nor did he appear out of place. And that was the problem. Victoria had expected discomfort, unease, maybe even an early retreat before the main course arrived. But Jackie wasn't playing the part she had silently assigned him. Instead, he was too calm. From the bar, the navy-suited gentleman watched the scene unfold with an almost imperceptible smile. His glass of wine swirled lazily in his hand as if he were watching a performance, but Victoria wasn't sure who the real performer was anymore. Liam, the young waiter, had noticed too. He busied himself behind the counter, but his gaze flickered toward Jackie's table every so often. There was something unspoken in there. The tension was growing. And Victoria? She could feel the first pangs of something she refused to acknowledge as doubt. When it came time for the main course, Victoria made a calculated decision. She took her time. The dish, a dry-aged Wagyu filet, accompanied by a truffle risotto and a carefully selected wine pairing, was ready within minutes. But instead of bringing it to the table, Victoria made sure it sat under the warming lamps just a little longer. Let him wait. She moved with purpose, prioritizing other guests, chatting at length with well-dressed patrons, ensuring that La Vienne's true clientele received the service they expected. And yet, every time she stole a glance at Jackie's table, he remained unchanged. He wasn't looking at his watch. He wasn't shifting in his seat. He was waiting, and waiting, and waiting. The restaurant's energy shifted. Conversations had become quieter, eyes drifting toward the lone diner in the corner. It was no longer just an interaction between a waiter and a guest. It was an unfolding spectacle. At a nearby table, the young couple who had been observing Jackie whispered between themselves. The woman, dressed in a sleek navy gown, watched intently. "He's still there," she murmured. "Unbelievable," her fiancé replied. Another table, closer to the bar, had also begun paying attention. A businessman in a tailored gray suit tapped his fingers against his whiskey glass, listening without looking. Victoria could feel it happening, the slow loss of control. She had played this game before. She had seen uncertainty bloom in a patron's eyes, the quiet panic of realizing they had stepped into a place meant for someone else. This should have been no different. So why wasn't it? With a forced breath, she finally retrieved the plate and walked toward Jackie's table. "Your main course," she said, placing the dish in front of him with a deliberate lack of warmth. There was no grand gesture, no flourish of hospitality. The fillet landed on the table with a muted thud, the cutlery clinking softly against the porcelain. Victoria waited. She waited for hesitation, for a flicker of uncertainty, for any sign that she had one. But Jackie simply looked at the dish, then at her. "Thank you." No reaction. No discomfort. Victoria's fingers twitched. "Are you sure?" she asked, lowering her voice slightly. Jackie raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" She tilted her head, forcing a polite smile. "It's a very refined dish. Not everyone enjoys it." For the briefest second, she thought she saw amusement flicker in his expression. "I'm sure it's excellent." Victoria's jaw tensed. She turned sharply on her heel, retreating back toward the bar before the frustration could creep into her expression. Behind her, Jackie picked up his fork and knife, cutting into the fillet with ease. Across the room, the navy-suited gentleman took another sip of his wine, his smile deepening. And then, as Victoria reached the bar, the shift happened. The young couple whispered again, but this time they weren't the only ones watching. The businessman in the gray suit leaned back in his chair, expression thoughtful. The bartender, usually indifferent to floor politics, had stopped mid-polish, his eyes fixed on the quiet war unfolding. Even Liam, the junior waiter, had taken a step closer. And worst of all, Victoria could feel it. She wasn't in control anymore. Jackie's calm acceptance had turned the tide. The more she had tried to push him away, the more intrigue he had drawn. And now it was no longer just about him. It was about her. Her choices, her behavior, her assumptions. The weight of silent judgment pressed down like an invisible force. And Jackie? He continued his meal, oblivious or entirely aware. Either way, he had already won. The energy in La Vienne had shifted from quiet judgment to something far more dangerous. Curiosity. People weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting. Victoria could feel it pressing against her, tightening around her ribs like a coiled rope. It was subtle, invisible to those not paying attention, but for her, it was suffocating. And all because of him. Jackie Chan hadn't done anything. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't caused a scene. He had simply existed in a space she had deemed not meant for him. And somehow in his silence, he had turned the entire restaurant against her. The realization settled over her like a slow-building storm. She had played this game too many times before. Subtle exclusion, quiet condescension, the kind of social warfare that left no fingerprints. It had always worked. It was supposed to work. But tonight she was losing. And the worst part, she didn't know why. She forced herself back behind the bar, gripping the edge of the polished counter as if steadying herself against the shifting ground beneath her feet. Liam, the junior waiter, hesitated nearby, pretending to busy himself with an untouched glass. She could see the uncertainty in his expression, the way his hands twitched as if debating whether or not to say something. "Everything all right?" he finally asked, voice careful. Victoria's nails pressed into the wood. "Fine." Liam didn't believe her. She could tell. He had seen everything. Worse, so had everyone else. From the bar, she could see the businessman in the gray suit murmuring something to his companion. The engaged couple at the center table had long since stopped pretending not to stare. Even Marcus, the sommelier, was watching her. And in the farthest corner, still seated with unshaken composure, was Jackie. His meal nearly finished, his presence undisturbed. And then the final blow landed. The moment Victoria had feared. A hush swept over the room as the restaurant doors swung open, revealing a group of young children dressed in martial arts uniforms, accompanied by their parents. They were glowing with excitement, their eyes scanning the room with eager, restless energy. And then one of them froze. A boy, no older than 10, eyes widening with disbelief. "Dad," he whispered, voice urgent. His small hand tugged on his father's sleeve, pointing toward the far corner. "It's him. It's Jackie Chan." The words landed like a thunderclap. The restaurant, once a stage for whispered judgment, was now suspended in shock. The engaged woman gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The businessman in the gray suit stiffened, eyes snapping toward the corner. Even Marcus, the sommelier, hesitated in his routine, his fingers gripping the neck of an unopened wine bottle, as his gaze flickered toward the man they had all dismissed. And Jackie? He sighed a soft, knowing exhale, before setting down his fork with deliberate ease. He had been recognized, and suddenly everything changed. The air in La Vienne grew electric, the shift almost physical. Every pair of eyes turned toward him, but this time, not with judgment, with awe. Excitement rippled through the children as their whispers grew louder, urgent. Parents, unsure whether to encourage or restrain their kids, exchanged glances before hesitantly stepping forward. And Victoria? She could only watch as the narrative shattered around her. The man she had condescended to, the man she had judged, the man she had ignored. He was Jackie Chan, the Jackie Chan, a man who had transcended the limitations of film, whose influence stretched beyond screens, beyond generations. a global icon, and she had treated him like a beggar. The weight of it all crashed into her, leaving her drowning in humiliation. The boy, eyes bright with admiration, was the first to step closer. Mr. Chan. His voice, barely above a whisper, held the kind of reverence usually reserved for legends. Jackie turned to him, the same quiet smile still lingering on his lips. Yes. The boy hesitated for only a second before reaching for the black belt wrapped around his waist, untying it with the carefulness of someone handling something sacred. Can you sign this? For a moment, silence. Then Jackie nodded. The entire restaurant watched as he took the belt gently, retrieving a pen from his jacket pocket. He didn't rush, didn't scribble mindlessly. Instead, he wrote something thoughtful, something the boy would carry with him forever. When he handed it back, the child beamed. And that was when the floodgates opened. Other children rushed forward, their excitement spilling over into gasps and eager whispers. Parents, no longer hesitant, followed, pulling out their phones. The businessman in the gray suit stood abruptly, adjusting his cufflinks as if composing himself before making his way toward the scene. The engaged couple. They were already halfway there. In the span of mere seconds, Jackie Chan had gone from an ignored man in the corner to the undeniable center of the universe. And Victoria? She had disappeared from it entirely. As she stood frozen behind the bar, she felt a presence beside her. Marcus. The sommelier leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything, not at first. And then, in a quiet, measured voice, he asked, "Tell me, Victoria, who do you think truly doesn't belong here?" The word sliced through her, cutting deeper than any reprimand, any punishment. She had spent the entire evening deciding who was worthy. And in the end, it was she who had been left behind. The air inside La Vie Inn had transformed. What had once been a quiet sanctuary of exclusivity had now become something entirely different. Victoria felt it in every whisper, every stolen glance, every lingering moment of hesitation. The carefully constructed illusion she had built over years, the silent power she held over customers through subtle gestures and quiet disdain, was gone. Jackie Chan had never needed to say a word. His presence alone had turned the tide against her. She stood behind a bar, gripping the polished counter like a lifeline. The weight of her failure pressed against her ribs, threatening to crush her beneath the sheer gravity of what had just happened. And the worst part? She had done it to herself. The young boy, now clutching his newly signed belt, had returned to his parents, his face glowing with pride. Around him, the other children spoke in excited bursts, their energy contagious. But it wasn't just them. Patrons who had once avoided looking in Jackie's direction were now approaching hesitantly, as if realizing too late that they had missed their chance to witness something remarkable. The engaged couple had moved closer, their earlier curiosity now replaced by admiration. Even the businessman in the gray suit, who had spent the evening sizing Jackie up, had abandoned his air of indifference. Victoria could barely stand to watch. The man she had judged, the man she had undermined, the man she had mocked. Now he was the center of the room, and she who had once held command over La Vie Inn had become invisible. Marcus, the sommelier, had never taken his eyes off her. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't smiling. He was simply watching, as if waiting for her to understand something. Something she wasn't sure she wanted to understand. The moment that sealed her fate arrived so quietly that at first, Victoria didn't even register it. Jackie, still seated, had picked up his bill folder and opened it with the same unwavering calm he had carried all evening. Victoria's stomach twisted. She had ensured the total was as high as possible. She had added every extra charge she could justify, intent on making his departure as humiliating as possible. Now, as he scanned the numbers, she braced herself for the moment of realization, for a flicker of panic, for some sign that he regretted sitting down at all. But it never came. Instead, Jackie reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a sleek black credit card. The kind of card that didn't just imply wealth, it defined it. Victoria felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The businessman in the gray suit straightened, his eyes locking onto the card with the kind of recognition that only came from experience. The engaged couple exchanged glances. Even Marcus, who had remained so calm, let his expression shift, not to shock, but to something close to satisfaction. Jackie placed the card on top of the bill with effortless precision. "I believe this will be sufficient," he said. The words carried no arrogance, no malice, no cruelty, and yet they were devastating. Victoria's fingers trembled as she took the bill folder, her breath shallow, her pulse rapid. She turned abruptly, her steps unsteady as she moved toward the payment terminal. The restaurant had fallen silent. Everyone was watching. Everyone had seen. And then, the doors to La Vienne swung open once more. A woman stepped inside, dressed in a sleek black dress, her dark hair swept into a simple but elegant bun. She carried herself with effortless confidence, scanning the room with the trained eye of someone who understood spaces like this. Victoria recognized her instantly. Elena Moreau, the owner of La Vienne. And she was not smiling. Elena's presence spread through the restaurant like a slow-moving fire, her gaze missing nothing. The murmurs died instantly. Even the most powerful of patrons, the ones who prided themselves on their influence, seemed to shrink beneath her scrutiny. She wasn't known for making appearances. She didn't need to. But tonight, something had brought her here. She approached Jackie's table without hesitation, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. Victoria barely dared to breathe as she watched from behind the bar. Elena stopped beside Jackie's seat, offering a polite nod. "Mr. Chan," she said smoothly, "I sincerely hope your experience tonight has been," she hesitated, "memorable." Jackie looked up at her, his expression still impossibly calm. "It has," he replied. "Nothing more. Nothing less." But the weight of those words was undeniable. Elena turned her head slightly, her gaze landing directly on Victoria. It was a look that held 1,000 unspoken sentences. A reckoning. Victoria had always believed herself untouchable in La Vienne. She had built her reputation carefully, cemented her authority over years of subtle power place. She had crafted an image of someone indispensable. But tonight, Jackie Chan had torn it apart without ever meaning to. And now, standing under Elena's unrelenting gaze, she realized something terrifying. She had miscalculated. Jackie hadn't just exposed her for who she was. He had forced everyone to see it. And Elena Moreau had seen it too. Victoria opened her mouth, to apologize, to explain, to justify. But nothing came out. There was nothing she could say. She had spent years deciding who belonged. Tonight, she had learned what it felt like to be on the other side. And as Jackie stood, offering Elena a polite nod before moving toward the exit, Victoria realized with horrifying clarity, she had just lost everything. The restaurant stood in silence, its usual hum of quiet conversations and soft piano melodies replaced by an undeniable tension. The weight of the night's events hung in the air like an unfinished symphony, each note lingering, waiting for resolution. Jackie Chan had not only exposed La Vienne's superficial elegance, but he had also revealed something far more profound, the quiet cruelty that had festered beneath its polished surface. And now, as he stood, preparing to leave, the lesson was almost complete. Victoria stood motionless, the credit card slip still clenched in her trembling hands. She had spent years cultivating an impeccable image of control, weaving herself into the very fabric of La Vienne. But in a single evening, it had unraveled. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts, her mind racing for a way to salvage the situation, to undo what had been done, to regain what had been lost. But how could she? Jackie hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't humiliated her. He hadn't retaliated in any way. And yet, he had dismantled her entirely. Elena Moreau, the woman who had built this empire, stood beside Jackie now, her expression unreadable. She was a figure of calculated power, a woman who never acted impulsively. Victoria had spent years trying to impress her. Now Elena was looking at her as if she were nothing more than a failed investment. "Victoria," Elena's voice was smooth, controlled, dangerous. Victoria's throat tightened. "I assume you have something to say." The words cut deeper than any reprimand. A part of Victoria wanted to fight back, to defend herself, to insist that she had only been upholding the restaurant's standards. But how could she? Not after tonight. She opened her mouth, but the words refused to come. A moment passed, then another. Jackie watched with the same unshakable serenity that had unsettled her all evening. He had no need to add anything. The damage had already been done, and she had done it to herself. Jackie reached for the signed bill folder, his fingers calm, deliberate. He scanned the final amount once more, then picked up a pen and paused. For the first time that evening, He looked directly at Victoria. "Every service deserves acknowledgement," he said simply. The words, spoken with such sincerity, hit like a stone to the chest. And then, before Victoria could even process them, he wrote a tip. Not just the expected 20%, but far more. A sum that made her eyes widen in disbelief. He wasn't punishing her. He wasn't humiliating her. He was teaching her. Jackie closed the folder and placed it on the table. Then, with the same quiet grace that had carried him through the evening, he turned toward the exit. And just like that, he was gone. The moment Jackie stepped out of La Vienne, the entire restaurant seemed to exhale. The energy that had once revolved around him now turned inward. Patrons who had spent the evening watching from the sidelines suddenly felt the weight of their own silence. They had seen what had happened. They had witnessed the arrogance, the cruelty, the ugliness disguised as exclusivity. And now they had to sit with it. Elena didn't move for a long moment. She stood in silence, watching the door long after Jackie had disappeared into the night. Then, finally, she turned to Victoria. "Tomorrow morning," Elena said, her tone measured, "we will have a discussion about your future here." The words weren't an immediate dismissal, but they weren't a promise either. Victoria swallowed hard. She wanted to plead, to insist that she could change, that she could fix this. But could she? For the first time, she wasn't sure. Across the dining room, conversation slowly resumed, but the tone had shifted. People whispered not about what they had eaten, but about what they had seen. The businessman in the gray suit, who had been so eager to dismiss Jackie, suddenly found himself stirring his wine without drinking it. The engaged couple, who had come expecting a night of celebration, now held hands in quiet reflection. And the young boy, still clutching his signed karate belt, looked up at his parents with a newfound understanding of respect. Victoria didn't move. The weight of everything that had transpired pressed against her chest, suffocating in its finality. Jackie had never raised his voice. He had never sought revenge. He had simply allowed the truth to reveal itself. And it had. Now she was left to face it. The heavy glass doors of La Vienne swung shut, sealing off the elegant dining room from the outside world. But the air inside had shifted. The once pristine atmosphere, carefully cultivated to exude exclusivity, now felt exposed, as though the restaurant itself had been unmasked. Jackie was gone, but the lesson he left behind lingered. Victoria stood in place, her hands still clenched around the signed bill folder. Her body felt frozen, her mind replaying the events of the evening on an endless loop. She had spent years mastering the art of control, knowing exactly how to manipulate a guest's experience, when to smile, when to make them feel small, when to ensure they understood their place. Yet Jackie Chan, with his calm demeanor and unwavering patience, had dismantled everything she thought she knew without lifting a finger. Her fingers tightened around the leather folder, the number he had written for the tip burning into her palm like a brand. It was too much, not just in amount, but in meaning. He had paid her more than she deserved. And that was the worst punishment of all. Elena Moreau, the owner of La Vienne, remained poised, her presence looming over the moment like a silent judge. Her restaurant had been her life's work, built brick by brick on the promise of exclusivity. She had curated every detail, the clientele, the service, the experience. And tonight she had seen it weaponized. Victoria had been her best waitress, her most polished representative. Yet she had let her arrogance rot away her professionalism. Slowly, deliberately, Elena extended her hand. "Give me the bill folder." Victoria hesitated, her fingers reluctant to release the evidence of her failure. But one look at Elena's unwavering stare, and she knew there was no room for defiance. She handed it over. Elena opened it, her sharp eyes scanning the amount before lingering on the words Jackie had written beneath it. Her expression, always unreadable, shifted, just slightly. Something flickered there. Was it guilt? Was it understanding? No one knew. But then, in the same smooth motion, she closed the folder and turned away. "Go home, Victoria. We'll speak in the morning." The words weren't an immediate dismissal, but they carried the weight of something irreversible. Victoria nodded once, stiffly, before turning and walking toward the back of the restaurant, her posture rigid with unspoken emotion. She had walked these halls 1,000 times before, confident, powerful, untouchable. But tonight, every step felt heavier. Around the restaurant, the murmurs had not died down. Patrons who had once dined in blissful ignorance were now exchanging glances, some filled with quiet shame, others with quiet admiration. The businessman at table 7, who had barely looked up from his imported wine, now found himself stirring the liquid aimlessly, his mind elsewhere. The young engaged couple, whose evening had begun with excitement and celebration, now sat in thoughtful silence, their hands intertwined. The elderly man in the navy blue suit, the one who had first spoken up, watched the room with knowing eyes. And the young boy with the karate belt still clutched in his hands? He was smiling, because he understood something now, something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Beyond the dining room, in the kitchen, the tension was just as thick. The chefs, the servers, the busboys who had gone unseen all night, they had witnessed everything. Some had silently rooted for Jackie from the shadows. Others had been afraid to step in. But now they stood together in an unspoken agreement. It shouldn't have taken this long. One of the junior waiters finally murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. No, the head chef agreed. It shouldn't have. They had let the culture of the restaurant define them. And now it was time for a change. Victoria arrived at La Vienne just as the sun began to rise, her nerves wound tighter than ever. The restaurant, always silent at this hour, now felt different, as though the very walls had absorbed the weight of what had happened. She had barely stepped inside when she saw Elena already waiting for her. No pleasantries. No small talk. Sit, Elena said simply. Victoria did. A tense silence stretched between them before Elena finally spoke. I built this restaurant to be the best, she began, her voice steady. To represent luxury, excellence, class. A pause. Tell me, Victoria, do you think we succeeded? Victoria knew better than to lie. She swallowed hard, then answered the only way she could. No. Elena's expression didn't change. Then we need to decide what comes next. Victoria sat rigid, waiting for her fate to be handed down. A firing. A demotion. But Elena did something unexpected. She slid a new menu across the table. Victoria blinked, confused. What is this? The future, Elena said. A restaurant built on something real. We don't change everything, but we change enough. Because last night, Jackie Chan didn't just expose you. He exposed all of us. Victoria stared at the menu, her hands shaking slightly. This wasn't a punishment. This was a chance, a choice. To stay, to change, or to walk away. A month later, La Vienne was not the same restaurant. The chandeliers still sparkled. The food was still exquisite. But the soul of the place had shifted. There were new rules, a new culture, one where every guest mattered, not just the ones who looked like they belonged. Victoria still worked there, but she wasn't the same person. And neither was La Vienne.